With Tony Blair, John Prescott and the other members of the new cabinet who've just been sworn in as Privy Councillors. It's been rather a nerve-wracking day for senior Labour politicians as the Prime Minister put the finishing touches to his top team. As the new cabinet arrived at Buckingham Palace, they must have been pondering the irony. Labour wants to be radical for the millennium, but today sees one of Britain's most archaic traditions, when new ministers must kneel on a footstool before the Queen and then kiss her hand. Earlier today, the new cabinet paid homage to a Prime Minister clearly prepared to take harsh decisions. The biggest surprise was the appointment of Frank Dobson to one of Labour's most important new jobs, Health Secretary. Earlier press speculation had put him down for demotion. He replaced Chris Smith, who got national heritage. Closely observing all the comings and goings, a journalist at the new Statesman preparing a special election edition.
Chris Smith is viewed with some suspicion by some members of the Treasury team, particularly Gordon Brown, I think, who sees him as an instinctive high spender. And probably Brown himself would not have been entirely happy with Chris Smith at the Health Department, which is one of the biggest spending departments of all. On the other hand, he was seen as a highly successful shadow heritage spokesman who would regard the job certainly as an enjoyable one, he said to us in an interview recently. By contrast, Frank Dobson has held the health brief before in opposition during the 80s. Frank Dobson's been around for such a long time, seen as solid and reliable, and that's probably what they regard as needed at the time being.
It had been thought that Harriet Harman too would be moved downwards, but she gets social security, where Labour's crucial welfare to work programme will be devised. However, she will get a minder, Frank Field, as Minister of State.
The most significant appointment that has been made is that of Frank Field at Social Security. It might not be in the cabinet, but it doesn't matter. He will have his hands on what is basically an innocent-sounding phrase, which is this wish to modernise the welfare state. But in someone like Field's hands, it will be very radical indeed. Field has put out piles and piles of detailed proposals which challenge many deeply embedded beliefs within the Labour Party and outside. And with him in that department, allied closely with Gordon Brown, they get on very well together. I expect to see very radical reform of social security and the welfare state in the coming couple of years.
By taking the Northern Ireland portfolio, Mo Mowlam is immediately confronted by Labour's most pressing responsibility. Sinn Féin's success in gaining 2 seats in the election has undermined constitutional nationalism. But will the new government make an IRA ceasefire more likely?
Naturally, I wish Mo Mowlam well in what is a very difficult body of work she must now conduct. I think that it is now clear to most people on this island that there is now a real new opportunity for a peace settlement under a Labour government. Whether or not that Labour government is up to the task, I think, remains to be seen. But it is certainly my hope that they will move forward with considerable imagination and dynamism towards the type of talks which are required to resolve the conflict.
The other crucial appointments today included the controversial left-winger Clare Short.
I'm going to try and be good, I always do, but I can't help being me.
Clare Short gets a new cabinet post of international development. She herself had worked in a private office like this in the 70s.
I know that the civil service are not a bunch of demons. After all, I was one. That you need efficient, good people to work in government well. There's a lot of very sincere committed public servants, or at least there were in my day, and I assume some of them have lasted these trying times.
What was your reaction to this appointment?
I was pleased. I was, I mean, there's been stuff in the press. So at first it said I wouldn't be, and then it said I would be. So by the time I got there, I thought it was going to happen. And I'm not elated, actually. I think the election result was so big. It was such a historical movement of people's opinion. I feel, I know all politicians say this, but quite humbled and in awe of the task that the people have given us, and that we must deliver.
The Deputy Prime Minister was enjoying one of the perks of his new job, a day out at the Rugby. He too heard news today of his new team at the Super Ministry. Gavin Strang will be Transport Minister, Michael Meacher, Environment.
Well, Martha Kearney is, as you saw a moment ago, down at Buckingham Palace. What actually has been going on when they go in to see the Queen?
Well, it's one of those times when you really wish there was a camera inside to see some of the old Labour hands going through this ceremony. It dates back to the Middle Ages, apparently, and it's called the kissing of the hands. So they have to go in, kneel on a footstool, and then kiss the Queen's hand, which is fairly straightforward. But then they have to walk backwards out of the room, which I gather sometimes causes some consternation. However, some of the people who were already members of the Shadow Cabinet are Privy Councillor members already. So they've been through that, and they just have to go through the second part of the ceremony, which is taking an oath of allegiance to the Queen. Something you may remember that Tony Benn had a bit of trouble with a few years ago.
But they all managed to walk backwards all right, did they?
As far as we
No
know,
one
we
fell
didn't see
over.
anyone
Right.
coming out with any bandages.
Okay. Now, can you help us with why is it that Tony Blair has made these changes as between the Shadow Cabinet and the real Cabinet?
Well, the normal Labour Party rule is that the people who are elected to the Shadow Cabinet should go on and be members of the first Labour Cabinet. But I have it on good authority from an official Downing Street spokesman that, quite frankly, there were too many bums for not enough seats, which means that there were paid cabinet jobs that the Prime Minister was allowed to allocate. He was able to have 22 paid jobs, which meant there were some people who just had to go. And out of the elected members of the Shadow Cabinet, that was Tom Clark and Michael Meacher, characterised as old right and old left, who have been demoted to Minister of State. There were other reasons for the changes too, though. He put Donald Dewar into Scotland to oversee the very difficult role of constitutional reform, of devolution in Scotland.
Sure, he's a lawyer there, but why has he put Frank Dobson in charge of health, which he thinks apparently, allegedly, is so important?
Well, I've been told that it's because Frank Dobson was a very successful shadow health minister in the 80s.
But he's got a beard.
I think if a beard was to stop people from having jobs, there'd be very few people with jobs.
It's not very new Labour, is it?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily that you have to have somebody who's new Labour in this job. They say that overseeing health at the moment is a job that just needs a safe pair of hands.
Yeah.
And I think you'll agree with me that Frank Dobson is indeed a safe pair of hands,
Yes,
beard or no beard.
Certainly lower expectations, anyway. Thanks, Martha.
Okay.
Conservative Central Office confirmed tonight that Michael Heseltine won't be a candidate for the leadership of his party. The ambition which has driven his political life is over. The statement came a few minutes after the news that Mr Heseltine had been taken to hospital in Banbury with chest pains. He's staying in over the weekend for observation. The fight to lead the Conservative Party, or what remains of it, hasn't officially begun yet. Ken Clarke is still the only one with his hat officially in the ring. But today, Michael Colvin, the MP for Romsey, said not him of course, someone should stand aside, so Chris Patten can come back from Hong Kong to stand. Now, in a moment, we'll be talking with a number of Tories who care enough about the future of their party to be here instead of gearing up for the Eurovision Song Contest. First, though, Mark Mardell.
Michael Heseltine's lifetime's ambition was to become Prime Minister, but now he himself has ruled himself out of the contest to lead the Conservative Party. During the campaign, he had played a prominent part, designing one advert himself and frequently riding to John Major's defence.
And this guy has presided over it in a way that ought to be a matter of huge public acclaim, as opposed to a daily feeding fever by the media trying to find infinite trivia to undermine our performance.
I'll tell you what, whatever it was Michael had for breakfast, if you come early, you can all have it tomorrow.
This is very dramatic news indeed for the Conservative Party. First Michael Portillo, now Michael Heseltine. The two men who last week seemed certain to vie for the leadership are now both out of the race. Mr Heseltine's decision to rule himself out of the leadership contest will come as a blow to the pro-European left within the Conservative Party. Their plan for a long time had been to vote for Ken Clarke on the first ballot, then switch to Michael Heseltine on the second. And this wasn't very far-fetched at all. Not only the bookies' favourite, Michael Heseltine did look like the unity candidate. It's true that some on the right wing will never forgive him for his part in Mrs Thatcher's downfall.
I will therefore allow my name to go forward into the second round.
However, it was increasingly looking as if his stature, his experience and his frequent barnstorming performances would make him the ideal choice for a Conservative Party crushed by defeat and in need of a self-confident leader. But that is not to be. As the election drew to an end on Thursday night, Mr Heseltine's friends were saying he would definitely stand. But friends of the family say his wife Anne had been asking him not to take on any extra work, and his illness has obviously made him take the same view. Old colleagues are sad he's not standing.
Some sorrow that he won't be available to play a leadership role in the immediate future. He is, the Conservative Party now has to work out how to become an effective and constructive opposition, and to unite to do so and not waste energies blaming everybody for the defeat. And Michael Heseltine has enormous skills which he deployed in opposition before, very effectively indeed, and I am very sorry that he won't be a candidate for doing that again.
The Tory left now have a problem. The former Chancellor has said he'll stand, but he's so hated by the hard right that it seems very unlikely that he could win, impossible that he could unite the party.
Are you going to be a candidate this time again? Well, I'm giving it very serious thought, as I'm sure you know, Simon.
Suddenly, Stephen Dorrell looks rather good. Debating with John Redwood on Radio 4 this morning, he's signalling that the party should not elect a very right-wing leader.
What the Conservative Party has to do is to attract back the different parts of the Conservative vote that splintered away on Thursday in order to rebuild the Conservative Party as the authentic voice of the centre-right majority, which I believe is still the central fact of British politics.
The youthful former Welsh Secretary is also gaining momentum. Some in the party feel that while he may not be too young, he is too inexperienced, and putting him in would be too much of a gamble. Friends say he definitely will stand, although he's not declaring at the moment.
I think the sensible thing for me is to take the time to think it over. A decision such as the one that I'm being asked to make is a big step, and it is quite right to spend some days thinking about it carefully.
Michael Heseltine was the bookies' favourite. Now he's ruled himself out, Mr Hague moves into that position from second place. His former parliamentary aide at the Welsh office, enjoying a day at the races, says he's the right man for the top job.
I don't believe somebody who is associated with being so pro-Europe, for instance, would be able to do that. And I don't think somebody who is so hostile to the European community would be able to do it either. The one thing that we really suffered from during this general election was the problem of being split. And somebody like William Hague, I believe, could unite the party together and be able to take us forward.
The race for the leadership, difficult to predict before tonight's news, is now right open. The left are looking for someone who won't leave them completely out in the cold.
He was always a unifier, someone that could keep us together, someone that could come in and lead if necessary. That option is gone, so therefore the obligation upon us all now is to keep the act together without him, bearing in mind that it may not be quite so easy as it would have been having him there.
Somebody else ruled themselves out today, Chris Patten, the Governor of Hong Kong. This despite a senior MP, Michael Colvin, saying that someone, but not him, should stand down from a safe seat to let Mr Patten back into Parliament. Mr Heseltine first joined the Cabinet in 1979. He is, without doubt, the most senior active politician in Britain today. His recognition that he will now never achieve his lifetime's ambition to become Prime Minister will shock the Conservative Party. It means all the other candidates have everything to play for.
Well, Michael Heseltine is reported to be comfortable in hospital this evening. We've just received this statement from his wife.
The Central Office has made a statement saying he's not going to stand.
It's my statement, in fact, which they very kindly put out for me, because I thought that would end any form of query.
How do you feel about that, Mrs Heseltine?
I'm delighted.
When was that decision made?
Well, we've been hovering and hovering, and we've been sort of mulling it over, and I think probably the fact that, you know, this happened today, insignificant as it is, was the final sort of, right, we won't do it.
Well, our Michael Crick has just written a biography of Michael Heseltine. Michael, she sounded pretty relieved about it. It'll be a fantastic disappointment to Heseltine himself, though, won't it?
Well, it will in a way. I mean, Anne Heseltine, I think, since 1993, when he had his heart attack, was very unhappy with the idea of him running for the leadership again, as was speculated. I think he was sticking around in case there was a good chance. But I think he found, particularly sort of since around about 95, the idea of becoming Tory leader less attractive than it once was, simply because the party is so divided at the moment.
But this does also significantly change what's going to happen in the contest for the leadership of the party too, doesn't it?
It does. I think there were some people who perhaps saw Heseltine as a possible caretaker who'd perhaps do the job for 2 or 3 years, while people like Portillo or Patten got their seats back and could then take over. And some people saw him as a caretaker while they marshalled their forces to support candidates who perhaps weren't going to win it just at the moment.
Michael, thanks very much. Well, we've gathered together here in the studio a number of Conservative activists from around the country to explore this question of who ought to get the leadership. Let's suppose we were a job selection board. Can we at least try to agree upon what qualities one ought to be looking for in someone who is going to become leader of the party.
Strong leadership.
Right, strong leadership, that's one.
Fundamental.
Okay, strong leadership.
Strength. He's got to unify the party. It's absolutely vital.
Right.
He's got to appeal to the electorate.
Yes.
Okay, electable.
Honesty and popularity with the people.
He's got to be able to inspire both his MPs and the public.
He needs a clear policy on Europe.
Yep.
Needs to listen, both to the party workers and to the people in the country.
Needs to be a listener and a leader. Sir Bernard, have you got anything you want to add to this impossible list?
I mean, exactly. The point is we're looking for a leader of the opposition that may not necessarily have exactly the same qualities as someone who is going to be Prime Minister. So all of those qualities that have been listed are relevant. We need, not only do we need somebody to unify the party, but we do need a bunch of MPs who want to be united. I think one of the problems we've had is a very strong leader, a wonderful leader in John Major, but we've had a group of people who for some reason did not want to be united.
Okay, well let's go on then to talk about individual people who might manage to fulfil this incredibly demanding list of criteria. Robert Halfon, who until election night did you have in mind to lead the party?
Well, I would have liked Michael Portillo to lead the party. I think he had a lot of support across the party.
How did you feel when he got knocked out then?
I, along with a lot of other people, we were devastated.
Who do you support now then for the job?
Well, it's a difficult choice, but I think that the next party leader has to have a clear policy on Europe, ruling out a single currency. I think he has to be able to unite the party. And I also think he has to have the strength to reform the party root and branch.
Right, so does a name come to mind?
Well, I'd be very happy if Peter Lilly put his name forward.
Peter Lilly, but we should say the only person who so far has put his name forward, as far as we know, is formally is Kenneth Clarke. Who else fancies Lilly?
I don't fancy him as a leader, but he'd
we're only talking.
He'd be a good chancellor.
He'd be a good chancellor. Okay, well that's not quite the same.
I wonder if we could add one other quite important point. You've got a bunch of people here, none of us actually have a vote. What I hope is that the Conservative members of Parliament, who are in this new Parliament, will get off their backsides and go out to the constituencies and talk to some of their people to see what we want. Now, that isn't to say we've got to vote, but we ought to have an influence.
Catherine Dibble, you were a PPC this time, or you were a parliamentary candidate this time in Wales, unsuccessfully, like most of your colleagues. Could you go with the Peter Lilly figure, or who would you have in mind?
I personally have a lot of time for Peter Lilly, but I would be worried about his electability. He is perceived, wrongly I would argue, but he's certainly perceived as being very much on the right of the party. And we have been beaten, and roundly beaten, by a party that has moved resolutely to the centre. And I think for us to try and move ourselves much further to the right, under a leadership of a Redwood figure or a Lilly figure, it just doesn't make electoral sense.
Okay, so who are you thinking about?
I think William Hague would be an excellent unifying figure.
Does anybody else fancy William Hague?
Yes, I do.
Yes, you do. Why?
Well, I think for several reasons. First of all, I think we've got to have a leader who is going to take the sort of middle ground and be able in some way to unite the party. The other point is most important, is we're fighting a Prime Minister who's 44. They've gone down a generation, and I think we've got to go down a generation as well. And if we're bringing somebody of William Hague's age, we're bringing forward somebody who's got 5 or 10 years to sort the problem out and get the party going. And the other thing that I think is very important is that we've got to have somebody who hasn't got any enemies.
He's pretty untested, though, isn't he? What do you think about William Hague?
Well, I'm not against him being a leader in the future, but I think at the moment what we desperately need is someone to actually puncture Tony Blair. And the only person, I believe, who has the experience and, in fact, the ability to do that is Ken Clarke. And I say that because Ken Clarke was an excellent Minister of Health. He did everything that the Conservative Manifesto said, and he won the argument. He won the argument on education, and he brought an excellent economic record to the general election, which was diverted, all attention diverted from that, by the extreme right of the party, who took this line. I personally think that John Redwood did more damage to our election chances than any member of the opposition.
But I think we've got a problem with Europe on Mr. Clarke, because I don't believe the majority of the Conservative members support Mr Clark's views on Europe.
They haven't had it explained to them.
I don't think that's the point.
Members of the party are moderately Eurosceptic, and Ken Clarke would not unite the party.
I'm sorry, the members of the party are not all Eurosceptic. The vast majority of the party supported John Major, and I really do believe that what was in our manifesto represented right across the party the views. It was a middle-of-the-road statement that all of us could support, and I personally find that the public did not like our candidates taking money to put in statements against the Prime Minister
I think the point
in
you're
their
making is that
constituency.
the Conservative Party, right, as a party, is not in favour of a European currency.
The Conservative Party doesn't know, none of us know what's going, if there's going to be one, and they don't know if it will be to our advantage.
You're absolutely right, but the problem is that the Conservative Party, or the majority of people, aren't in favour of a single currency, not in favour of looting it.
The majority of people say they want us to do what's best for Britain,
but they
and
don't
we won't know that until we know if there's a single currency, and if there is, then what the advantages and disadvantages are.
I want to just interrupt you there, because joining us down the line now from Southampton is Michael Colvin, who's, you think we should, the party could widen the pool, don't you, by somehow getting Chris Patten into the frame?
Not necessarily. What I really am saying, and I think that the programme so far has shown that the Conservative Party needs a period of introspection. I think we need to be careful not to rush in to the appointment of a leader or the election of a leader who's going to take us through to the next general election. And that's why I rather favour the idea of an interim leader, a caretaker.
Okay,
and it's tragic. Well, it's tragic that the one obvious person who I would have never voted for in government, but who would make an excellent caretaker would be Michael Heseltine, and he's not available. And I don't
and you think somebody should stand down to make way for him?
What? Who?
You think some MP should stand down to give someone like to give someone like Chris Patten the opportunity?
Well, perhaps in time, yes. I think that is a very good idea.
You would do that, would you?
Chris Patten should be able to throw his hat in the ring in time, but not
so
now.
you would stand down to give Chris Patten a run at it, would you?
No, no. But what
You
we
wouldn't.
want is a
But you think somebody
caretaker
else
leader
should?
in the meantime.
Well, I mean, why, if you're not prepared to do it yourself, why are you suggesting somebody else does it?
Well, because there are other people who may want to, but the point is we want a caretaker leader in the meantime, and there are other places that you could lead the party from. I mean, what about the House of Lords? We've had leaders in the House of Lords before.
Okay, anyone around this table prepared to tolerate the idea of a leader in the House of Lords? No. Right. Sir Bernard, do you think there is any rush, as Michael Colvin says, there's no rush?
No, I don't think there's a great urgency to appoint someone who we see necessarily as a long-term leader. The Conservative Party has to start to fight back. Now, we started. Yesterday we won a number of council seats in the shires, and that was good news. What people, particularly members of Parliament, overlook is that we're going to be fighting an election in 12 months' time, and in 2 years' time, and in 3 years' time. And the Conservative Party centrally has, to its cost, too often neglected local government and the people who have to fight those seats. So the real test of the leader isn't going to be in 4 years' time when you're beginning to fight a general election, but it's going to be in March, April '98, much sooner than people think. That's the test. So we want someone who has a bit of charisma and someone who has a little bit of drive to lead us.
Well, that all makes it all the more vital that we get this over and done with quickly, because the party, whether we believe it or not, has been devastated. We're on our uppers. We've got to do John Humphreys.
I'm so sorry. Well, I'll carry on being palely trying to imitate John Humphreys. The other character we haven't talked about really so far is John Redwood. Could you tolerate the idea of John Redwood?
Very much so.
You could.
I think he's the only hope for our party.
And
he's the only one. He's the same age as Mr. Blair. He's the only one that can pick this party up by the scruff of the neck. He's got the policies. He's got the vision, which we've been lacking.
The problem with John Redwood is that he won't unite the party.
He will.
He will split it right down the middle. John Redwood, as we've said already, was responsible for many, many divisions before this election ever started.
Do you have a suggestion of somebody who could unite the party, then?
I would have dearly liked to have seen Michael Heseltine stand. I think it's a great
well, okay, but given that he said he's not going to.
I think Clarke would be a good candidate, but what we've all got to consider is uniting the party, and I think Clarke has got enough enemies on the right. Redwood's got enough enemies on the left, and as we said, Hague doesn't really have enemies.
But isn't it abundantly clear from this discussion that there is no candidate who can unite the party because you're split from top to bottom?
There are two things. I think two things you have to consider. First of all, every one of the candidates that will emerge will have qualities of their own. There isn't one that will be mentioned that we couldn't say had particularly bad qualities.
I must tell you something, just come in my ear. Peter Lilly apparently is going to declare in the Mail on Sunday tomorrow.
Well, that's a very good way in which to tell the party, I suppose, as some of the party will read. I mean, the real answer is, of course, in answer to what was said, we've got a milkman that's 44. I don't suspect that we should put him into the field merely because he's the same age as Mr. Blair. There are other qualities that we need. Now, I believe we do want young, forceful thrust, but we need to see who's going to develop, and we won't have that opportunity unless we have somebody to lead the party to give us a breathing space.
You better be very, very quick.
I can't see somebody giving us a breathing space and then stepping down. Once they're in leadership, they're not going to step down.
Never going through this.
Right.
Well, the thing is, what I was going to say, you're talking about divisions.
I don't even have time to say it. I'm going to do another Humphreys on you, and I'm going to ask you to say we've stopped.
Right.
Thank you. Well, you know the ads for the lottery that say it could be you, and you know it's just marketing nonsense, but you buy a ticket anyway? Well, there are quite a few of new MPs like that. Maybe they were silly enough to take Tony Blair seriously when he said that Britain wasn't a landslide country. Anyway, the consequence is that places like Wimbledon for heaven's sake, now have Labour MPs. Here are the reflections of a couple of unlikely lads.
Slightly unbelievable, isn't it? I mean, this is true blue country, or so it was alleged. The defeated Conservative quite nicely came over to me and said, congratulations. And he was a bit of a slippery fella. So I said, about what? And he said, you've won. So that was a different matter.
It felt a bit like I was having an out-of-body experience, actually. But throughout the night, it was just so exciting.
To say congratulations. Very much. It's a fantastic thing. It really is.
We have to sign up, or sign on, as my agent said, sign on either Wednesday or Thursday. And it probably is queuing up on Wednesday and Thursday because there are a large number. And rather a large number of new ones. So they don't know exactly what to do, and we need a bit of guidance.
It's all new, isn't it? In the past, Finchley have had a twinning with Frank Dobson, who has been their twinned MP, and I was thinking yesterday, I wonder if they do that with spouses of new MPs, you twin them with somebody to tell them what it's going to be like. I have no idea. I can't go out down the road in my jogging pants and old shoes anymore, I think. I have to sort of think about everything before I leave the door.
I'm a lecturer in the University of East London, and there are another 4 or 5 weeks to go, and there are examination boards to have, there are exams to be marked, and I'm not going to let the students down.
Well, I was sitting in my living room last night and I thought, oh, I'm sitting here with an MP in my living room. You know, it's sort of those surprising little things that are happening, really. It's something we've all got to get used to.
Well, I put £10 on myself and I'm here to collect. I feel that I've achieved one of my ambitions. Many years ago I set out on this path and I finally reached this point, and now I need to start thinking about where I go from here.
Well, as I saw the votes stacking up, I was in quite a bit of shock, and I thought, oh my God, I'm going to give birth. I had to find a seat quickly. It was so exciting. We just couldn't quite believe it was happening, even though they could see the votes stacking up.
My life is going to change in more ways than one. I'm now an MP. I've had to give up a job that I was in for 14 years, so I'm moving into a great area of uncertainty. And of course, within a couple of months, I'm going to be a dad. So there's an awful lot happening at once, lots of new things to deal with, and really lots of things to juggle.
I, Slim Flake, returning officer for the Wimbledon constituency.
My first thoughts went to my family, my parents who were there and had given me such support through the campaign. I popped up and said I had a word with them and said brace yourselves, and then came back down and stood with our team, waiting for the final result to be announced. I hope I'll still be able to keep contact with university and with university life, and I've missed my students certainly through the last few weeks of the campaign, and I'll go and see them on Tuesday. But it's a very great transition indeed. It feels rather like the first day at school. I'll be sharpening my pencil and packing up my bag and presenting myself on Wednesday morning for a briefing with the Parliamentary Labour Party, and I'm looking forward to that very, very much indeed.
Well, they won't be pleased to hear it, but Enoch Powell once famously remarked that all political careers end in failure. As John Major drifted away from Downing Street to watch the cricket, it was time to start the political obituaries. Here was a man who failed to become a bus conductor but did run the country, who led his party to the worst defeat in 150 years, and who leaves no ism behind. His friend Norman Fowler will be defending him against Tony Howard's view that Mr. Major was second-rate in a moment. First, though, here's Michael Crick.
For the young child of today, will he remain a figure to look up to? By the time this schoolboy reaches adulthood, will his generation still remember much about him? At Madame Tussauds, they've already changed the caption and demoted our latest ex-Prime Minister to the back of a pillar. Perhaps John Major's greatest achievement is simply to have lasted for so long. Few people, when he was first elected in 1990, would have expected Mr. Major to survive in office for 6.5 years. But to survive as a historic figure and as a model here at Madame Tussauds is a far tougher proposition. For while they've got Disraeli and Thatcher and Churchill here, there's no Clement Attlee or Jim Callaghan. And now, will Mr. Major simply drift into obscurity and suffer the same kind of meltdown that afflicted his party this week?
I think friendship through football is a bit easier than friendship through politics, so I think you have the better way of doing it.
Some, of course, had already left in time. While John Major went watching cricket yesterday, this morning, a European soccer tournament in Oxfordshire was opened by his long-serving former Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd, one of Mr. Major's two rivals to succeed Margaret Thatcher.
I think his years are remarkable. Here is a man who was not a Thatcherite, who did not share all her intellectual, philosophical position, but who carried forward her reforms, not just sustained, not just kept them, but carried them forward on privatization and gave them a different flavor.
It's hard to believe now, but during his early days in command, with Britain facing war in the Gulf, John Major was the most popular Prime Minister in polling history, in part because he wasn't Mrs. Thatcher.
Thank you very much for what you're doing. I hope we won't have to keep you here too long. I hope we won't have to call on your fighting skills, but we shall see about that.
I'm not the sort of country that will put the mob back on the streets like we saw in 1979.
Success against Iraq, and more important, abolition of the poll tax, secured his unexpected 1992 election victory. The ordinary bloke from Brixton, who'd promised a classless society and a nation at ease with itself, mounted his soapbox in what was seen very much as a personal triumph for Mr. Major, achieved despite serious recession. The historian Ben Pimlott is among many who believe that given the circumstances, whoever had won in 1992 would probably have been doomed this time round.
It's one of the kind of great ironies of politics. Indeed, one might almost say there's a Greek tragic element to the John Major reign, that retrospectively, that was a government that should never have been born. If, in fact, Major had gone down in 1992 and Labour had taken office, Labour would have got all the opprobrium for things like being forced out of the ERM. You might now be seeing an election result approximately in reverse.
After Britain's humiliating withdrawal from the ERM, the Tories never recovered their reputation for economic competence.
Today has been an extremely difficult and turbulent day.
After Black Wednesday, John Major's authority was further eroded by tax rises, the row over pit closures, and above all, Europe. The 1991 Maastricht Treaty was considered a triumph for Major the negotiator, as he secured opt-outs for Britain on the single currency and the social chapter. But steering the Maastricht Bill through Parliament, with only a small majority, roused the ever more powerful tide of Tory Euroscepticism.
He tried different ways of handling the dissent in the party, but at the end of the day, it has been so deep that it couldn't entirely be handled by the leadership. That's perfectly true. I don't see that as a criticism of him. I see that as a criticism of others.
Many on the Tory right regretted supporting him in 1990 and felt betrayed. And in stark contrast to Margaret Thatcher, he was accused of being a day-to-day fixer with a whip's mentality, a charge most famously levelled by his sacked Chancellor.
There is too much short-termism, too much reacting to events, not enough shaping of events. We give the impression of being in office, but not in power.
Right, I think we can now say we're very nearly there.
Yet repeated attempts to look beyond the immediate often provoke derision, as when Mr Major extolled the virtues of warm beer and then launched his Back to Basics campaign.
We must go back to basics. We want our children to be taught the best, our public services to give the best, our British industry to be the best.
Only this big attempt to show vision was rapidly destroyed by the basic instincts of several Tory colleagues in a succession of scandals.
He's not a visionary, and if people want visionaries, they wouldn't have chosen him. I actually believe you need an alternation. You have visionaries all the time. The thing is going to, nobody's going to do the washing up. You've got to have carpenters, artisans, as well as architects.
Architect or carpenter, John Major leaves few imaginative monuments beyond the Citizens' Charter, the National Lottery and the Cones Hotline. Perhaps his greatest area of creativity and vision was Ireland, where the 18-month ceasefire was ultimately shattered by the Docklands bomb. Now the Prime Minister, who might have brought peace to Ireland, is more likely to go down in history for presiding over a civil war in his party, which 2 years ago even forced him to seek re-election.
In retrospect, one can say that this election result is the legacy of years and years of the public spectacle of internecine, incestuous warfare, which the public finally revolted against. However, I mean, the first job of a Prime Minister is to stay in office, and the extraordinary thing about the last 5 years is that Major actually, against the odds, fought it out and struggled through to the bitter end.
Today, finally free from office, Mr Major was relaxing at home. He rightly claims the economy is now stronger than in 1990, but his premiership conjured up few lasting ideas. Whereas Thatcherism still enjoys a lasting influence around the globe, Majorism never became more than a term of mockery.
Anthony Howard, what do you think history will make of John Major?
I think he will go in the second rank, very much the second rank of Prime Ministers. I don't think it's entirely his fault. He came to office on a double negative. He only got there because he wasn't Margaret Thatcher, and they were tired of her, and that he wasn't Michael Heseltine, and they were not going to take Michael at any price.
When you say second division, who are you thinking of him alongside?
I suppose he would go alongside what? Sir Alec Douglas-Hume, possibly alongside... no, I think it is. I mean, it's a much longer reign than Sir Alec's, but I don't think there will be any great contribution in the history books.
Sir Norman, do you think he has left any kind of lasting memorial, apart from the Combs hotline, of course?
I do, yes. And, I mean, I think the point I was making in the Express this morning was that he has never been really given credit for the achievements he's had. The number one achievement, which was touched upon in your piece, is the strong economy. We've got a stronger economy now than any time in my lifetime. That has been achieved by John Major.
It's been achieved on his watch. Whether it's been achieved by him is another matter, isn't it?
Well, again, you know, you make my point about the credit. If certainly the economy was in trouble, there's no question who would be blamed.
No, when the economy was in trouble, he said it was worldwide recession.
Well, there was a worldwide recession, and he took us out of the worldwide recession. He's given us a nation where we now argue about inflation at 2.5 or 2.7, when we used to be arguing at 25 or 27.
Well, I think that the economy is obviously the strongest card. He was a very good, I think, Chief Secretary to the Treasury. If I was pushed, I would have said that was about his level. But you can't go into politics and expect to be Prime Minister if you entirely lack vision. George Bush is the proof of that. Poor old George Bush, who had perhaps greater experience than Mr. Major had, but he wasn't any good as a president. He couldn't lift his eyes to the hills. And I'm afraid that was John Major's fault. Well, I mean, I remember once in 1995, Norman, when the government was in some trouble, poor old Ken Clarke had to be put up in a censure debate because the Prime Minister funked it, despite the fact that 4 days later, Ken Clarke was going to present a budget.
I think that's a remarkably unfair comment about a Prime Minister who, by almost anyone's standards, has taken himself and his party through one of the toughest times ever.
And yes, okay,
but he won the 1992 election when
didn't Neil Kinnock lose?
Exactly. The point again I make, you see, Anthony Howard, who I took the trouble of looking up the last time I'd come on the programme with Anthony Howard from Newsnight. I keep a little diary on this, and what Anthony Howard said then, Major, and this was in 1993. Major will soon fall, and he's just promoted his successor, Ken Clarke. Well, actually, I think, I don't know what Anthony Howard thinks, he's certainly wrong on one of those, and his comparison then was with...
If he had fallen, he might have won the last election.
His comparison was with Anthony Eden. He was a tough man, and, you know, like Douglas, Douglas Hurd, who was in your film, anyone who has seen...
Douglas Hurd said they needed someone to do the washing up.
He didn't quite say that, Jeremy. Even I think your shorthand's getting a bit rusty in this seat. Anyone who's seen him at close quarters knows it is a tough man. The pressures that he had of a very small majority. Remember, Margaret had a majority of 150 and 100. John Major had to get Maastricht through, which, incidentally, I believe that with the opt-outs, Margaret Thatcher would have been very happy to have had herself those opt-outs on the single currency and on the social chapter. Well, it may not be what she said, but I think, in fact, if you had served in her cabinet, she would have been happy with that. He had to get that through with a majority of under 20. That actually... obviously had that overloomed his premiership.
What he had, Norman, he did have an understanding of how the Conservative Party in the House of Commons worked. That great thing of standing for leadership. That was the work of a whip who understood, you know, where the bodies are buried.
No, it wasn't.
Well, he understood. He came out of the whip's office. He did understand the nature of the Conservative Party in the House of Commons. That's not good enough to be a Prime Minister.
But it wasn't. I mean, you know, this is the Rees-Mogg line. You know, he'd make a good Deputy Chief Whip and a bad year. I mean, that's basically what Rees-Mogg said. And but I mean, that wasn't the actual whip. Any whip who had actually been asked about that would have said no. And indeed, people like me would have argued against it. What John Major did then, he had a political instinct which people don't understand and didn't see. He had a political instinct to do the right thing. That was exactly the right thing to do. He won that. The criticism, I would have said, on that, he beat Redwood, he beat him conclusively. The criticism was that even then the party didn't get behind him.
Well, why didn't he show the smack of firm government when Horan and Pace stepped clearly out of line, and he just let them do it?
Come on, in the middle of an election campaign. Look, all these things are a criticism.
Well, Edward Heath said he would have sacked them.
Yeah, well, Edward Heath might say that now, but 20 years previous, in the middle of an election, I doubt very much whether that was the case. But what you're doing is stating the criticisms, which I share in spades, of the Conservative Party and the internal divisions inside the Conservative Party.
I think what he was
the lesson of this is not about John Major, it is about the Tory Party and the ability of the Tory Party to come together.
But he was like Henry VI, surrounded by barons who buffeted him and said, take that, take that, and go down for the
Okay, well, I tell you what, we're going to have to wait for proper historians to address it, but thank you both very much.
What do you mean?
Your first draft of history, okay. Look now at tomorrow's papers. The Tory leadership battle continues to be fought out in two of them. Peter Lilly tells the Mail on Sunday that he is best placed to reunite, rebuild and renew the Tory party. He says he won't rule out joining a single currency altogether, saying we must reaffirm ourselves as not anti-European or xenophobic, but pro-British. A poll of Tory MPs in the Sunday Telegraph puts Michael Howard as the favourite for the leadership contest. His own contribution to the paper is surprisingly upbeat. 179 majority looks awesome, he says, but it doesn't follow the Conservatives will need more than one Parliament to climb back. Just very quickly, Sir Norman, what do you make of Peter Lilly chucking his hat in the ring?
Well, I think it's interesting. I don't think he's going to win it. I don't think, I mean, I think that the much more significant event tonight is undoubtedly the fact that Michael Heseltine has withdrawn. That is extremely bad news for the Conservative Party, and I think all his friends will wish him well. But it's bad news for the party. I think Peter Lilly's is interesting, but probably no more than that.
Right, thank you both very much. Well, that's all from Newsnight tonight. You can see the former Chancellor Kenneth Clarke and the Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott on Breakfast with Frost tomorrow if you're up at 8:30 on BBC One. There'll be more from us next week. Until then, enjoy what's left of the bank holiday.
That Newsnight special replaced this week's Correspondent, which can now be seen next Saturday at the earlier time of 7:10 here on BBC Two.